I'm Jim Vandergriff, and I want to begin by establishing my credentials to talk about legends and fences. I served for a number of years as book review editor for the Missouri Folklore Society Journal and as editor of the journal for lots of years. I also briefly studied folklore with Barry Tolkien and informally with Jan Brunvan, and occasionally taught folklore at various colleges over the years. I'm also a former president of the Missouri Folklore Society and a member since 1977. Plus, I have published and or presented several articles on folklore, some on Eskimo folklore and others on Missouri folklore. I grew up around Richland, Stoughton, and Rolla, Missouri, in Laclede, Phelps, and Pulaski counties, in a family whose roots are 7 generations deep in that area. My first relative to move into the area was Dr. James M. Dodson, my fourth great grandfather, who in February 1832 moved his family into what was to become Camden County, where they established a town called Glaze City, now defunct. He died in December of the same year. Basically, a legend is a story that is meant to guide our behavior, to teach us the values of our culture. When folklorists speak of legends, they mean something a little more specific than just a story, though. A legend is a story that is generally told as if it were true and received as if it might be true. Legends are usually handed down orally, permitting them to vary over time. Elliot Oring, a well known American folklorist, has said that one of the characteristics of legends is that they make us examine our worldviews, our sense of the normal, the boundaries of the natural. Folklorist John W. Roberts, a former president of the Missouri Folklore Society, contends that stories such as these transmit our values. And Barbara Allen, another well known folklorist, also wrote that people would not continue to tell such stories if they did not convey some kind of truth. Jan Brunvan, perhaps the foremost authority today on legends, says legends are sometimes called folk history, and they are told as a way of explaining strange things that occur, and they are passed on in order to inform or warn. He also says they serve as a reaffirmation of commonly held values of the group to whom the stories belong. In other words, legends, by teaching us certain beliefs and or values, serve to maintain our cultural boundaries, much the same way a fence encloses our property. They keep some of us in and keep others out. Over the years, I have learned mainly from family stories that my family was connected very closely with some of the major events in the acquisition and settlement of the West. So I have a tendency to regard those stories as kind of symbolic of American stories in general. My great 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 grandfather's sister, Mary Watt Dodson Donahoe, for instance, was the first Anglo American woman to live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the first Anglo woman to travel the Santa Fe Trail. You may have read or been told or seen on TV that Susan McGoffin was the first Anglo woman to travel that trail, but she didn't make her voyage until 1845. Mary made hers in 1832. Mary's husband, William Donahoe, whom she met in Boonville, Missouri, and married in Columbia, Missouri, was a Santa Fe trader, a person who made his living transporting goods from Boonville across the Santa Fe Trail, then selling them to the Mexicans and Native Americans. Upon her arrival, Mary opened a hotel on the Santa Fe Square where the modern La Fonda Hotel now stands. Her hotel was also called La Fonda. Fonda just means inn or restaurant in Spanish. After she, like the rest of the Anglos, was forced to leave Santa Fe in the rebellion in 1841, she went to Clarksville, Texas, where, according to the librarian at the Fannin County Museum in Texas, She opened a hotel that later became the unofficial headquarters of the Texas Confederacy, meaning lots of Texas rebels hung out there during the war. Before Mary's move to Texas, her husband ransomed three captive women from the Comanches, and Mary took them across the Santa Fe Trail to Glaze City, Missouri, to her parents' home, where they could be looked after until they could be reunited with their families. One of the women, Rachel Parker Plummer, was a cousin of Quanah Parker, the last Comanche war chief, and himself the son of a captive woman, Cynthia Ann Parker. He was also the chief credited with ending the Comanche wars with the whites and convincing his people to accept reservation life. The other two women were Sarah Horn, who achieved some fame after she published her captivity account, and Rachel Harris, who died in Glaze City before she could be reunited with her family. A few years ago, the government of New Mexico erected a plaque dedicated to Mary and other women important to New Mexico history at the Raton Pass rest stop on Interstate 25. I see a lot of Western history in Mary's life, and her story was used to teach me how to live. That is, to persevere, to follow my heart. My grandfather, John Armstrong, who ultimately married Mary Donahoe's niece, was a Confederate soldier in General Starling Price's army, Company K, 16th Missouri Infantry, and fought in numerous battles in Missouri and Arkansas, Lexington, Westport, and Lone Jack in Missouri, and Prairie Grove and Helena in Arkansas. He was seriously wounded at Helena while charging a cannon emplacement and spent over a year recovering from the wounds. After the war, he became a newspaper man. He founded and ran the Lebanon Rustic, originally called the Stoutland Rustic, and next the Lynn Creek Rustic until his death in 1884. Like Mary Donahoe, John was presented as a role model, someone who followed his own beliefs and desires and who honored his promises. The stories about him taught me to follow my own stars. I point all this out sort of as the prologue to my main points. The points are, of course, as I said, that my family is sort of symbolic of Western American history, and also that the stories we grow up with are the things that shape our characters and our beliefs and values. And those shared beliefs and values are what make us a community. In other words, and to get to my main point, our shared beliefs and values work like a fence. They define what our community is and what it isn't, in the same way that a fence keeps in what we want and keeps out what we don't want. My great-grandmother, Lizzie Gibson, was the source of many of the stories I've heard, as I used to spend a couple of weeks with her, alone with her in the summers when I was a preteen, and she would entertain me with stories of her earlier life and of our family in general. Prior to the Civil War, her ancestors had been very well off, but because they were on the losing side of the war, lost pretty much everything. Her mother's father, Dr. William M. Dodson, in his own right, became a prosperous landowner, medical doctor, and preacher. And her father was a prosperous newspaper publisher and also a medical doctor, though I don't think John ever practiced medicine after he joined Price's army in 1861, though he did practice medicine before joining the army. His eldest brother, Jim Armstrong, was a college graduate, a successful banker, and a longtime Missouri state legislator. He was presented as an education role model. His off-duty pastimes included genealogy and family history, both of which I also dabble in. Her youngest brother, Kavanaugh, was pretty much a problem child, frequently involved in scraps, drinking, and the like. Sorry, I only have one picture of Cav taken when he was a teenager. Though he was obviously much loved, Cav was a model to avoid. One of the stories Grandma told me, and one that is known to about everyone of my generation and older who grew up in the part of Missouri I grew up in, has my great 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 grandfather as a central character. My lengthy research into it has convinced me that a central purpose of the story is to teach us who we are. In other words, it's a story that has the function of creating a bond between those of us who belong there. Over the years, all kinds of folk motifs and bits of other legends have accreted to it, but generally, it's a story filled with the events and places that we know. A story that sort of creates a world for us. In other words, it builds a fence around us, thus placing a barrier between us insiders and you outsiders. The story, which many of you have probably heard me tell before, goes something like this. On July 10th, 1839, a former slave of the Fulbright family who lived along Dry Graves Creek in what is now Laclede County broke into the Fulbright house while all the men were out in the field. His goal was to steal money. 10-year-old Amanda Fulbright caught him in the act and he stabbed her. She didn't die immediately, though, and was able to tell who had done it. The local men formed a posse and looked for Joe for about 3 weeks until finally Thomas Rafferty spotted him running across an open field toward the haystack in which he had been hiding and fatally shot him. Joe didn't die immediately, so the men sent for the doctor. But by the time Dr. Dodson arrived, it was too late. The doctor was William N. Dodson of Blaze City, Missouri, the only doctor in 40 miles, so the story says, and my third great grandfather. He rode his white mule, for which he was widely known, as the story says, like the wind to reach the scene. He arrived too late. The fact is that he rode at most 10 miles. Since Joe, who was black, couldn't be buried in the white cemetery, and since he had terrorized the local blacks while he was on the loose, demanding that they provide him food and not let anyone know where he was, and because they believed he had the evil eye, they didn't want him buried in their cemetery. So nobody knew what to do with the body. Dr. Dodson solved the problem by taking the body to a cave near his home, where over the next several weeks he carved up the body, boiled the flesh from the bones, and rearticulated the skeleton, taking careful notes on his study of anatomy as he did so. Legend is it that he used the skeleton in his medical practice for years afterward. The skeleton was in the family until 1944 when it was finally destroyed in a house fire, according to my mother, who claimed to have seen the skeleton many times as a child. Dr. Dodson had to stay in the cave with the body the whole time as the smell of the boiling flesh attracted wolves. I wasn't aware until I first heard this story that wolves were ever a problem in that area. And the young female slaves of the Dodson family had to bring him his food. The cave is about a mile or so from where his family lived in Glaze City. The following pictures of the remnants of Glaze City were taken about 1970, or the buildings have since been razed. All that is left there is the cemetery and a house that is said to be a duplicate of the original Dodson house. The slave girls were afraid to come all the way to the cave, so they would get as near the cave as they dared, then blow a whistle so he would know to come pick up his food. To this day, the cave is called Joe's Cave. The following are pictures of Joe's Cave taken about 1990. As you can see, the cave is quite near Dodson's home, a mile or so. The story goes on quite a bit from there, but that's kind of the central part of it. If you want to see the full story, I published an article about it several years ago in the Missouri Folklore Society Journal that includes the whole story. To me, the essence of that story is the values it embodies. I think it reaffirms the value system my grandmother held The family was an important part of the community. The racial caste system was a normal part of life. We pay meticulous attention to important details, study of anatomy, for instance, regardless of the hardships and so forth. This story is about who we, the family, are. Telling of the story often begins when someone asks why the one cave is named as it is. There are several other caves on that little 6 mile stretch of room. Hill House Cave, Carroll Cave, Perkins Cave. All the others are named with local owners' surnames except Bear Cave and Joe's Cave. And until the 1960s or 70s, the N word describing Joe was attached to it. As Bryn Van in particular says, legends exist in part to explain the unusual or to test our beliefs in the unusual. This story certainly does that. Bear Cave speaks for itself, but Joe's Cave is an anomaly. Another example handed down through my family involves one Sam Gibson, whom I believe was the grandfather of my great-grandfather, Harl Gibson. That is my third great-grandfather. This picture is Harl or Harley, my great-grandfather, after whom I am partly named. Sam was a well-off cattleman who periodically drove his cattle to St. Louis to market them. On one occasion, after he returned from such a trip, he was known to be carrying a large quantity of money on his person. He and a hired hand variously identified as a Foster or an Osborne. The Fosters and Osbornes were often villains in our family stories. Went to the fields to grub out some stumps. At the end of the day, neither man returned to the house, so Sam's sons went looking for them. They found Sam, his chin resting on a stump, his beard pinned in a crack in the stump, and a poleaxe buried in the back of his head. The money and the hired hand were gone. Sam's sons and my great-grandfather Harl and some other neighbor men set out to find the presumed murderer. As the story was told to me by my uncles and my mother, they tracked him down somewhere in Kentucky. The story goes on to say that no one ever knew for sure what happened because, though the men returned with part of the money, they would never divulge any details of their hunt. Of course, the implication is always that they caught the man and killed him, all without benefit of legal sanction. And of course, we Ozarkers generally sympathize, believing justice was done, which serves then to solidify our mutual belief system, to strengthen our community. I contend, though, that the story also teaches us what our obligations are to our family and community. Despite the law, these men did the right thing by avenging Sam. Another story Grandma used to tell, which I have told many times too, goes like this. She and Harl were living in the Indian Nations. Grandma never called it Oklahoma. She always called it the Nations, where Harl was a deputy U.S. Marshal. One night, Harl stopped by the house with a prisoner named Black Pete, a Cherokee whom he was taking to jail. Harl had been chasing Pete for several days and was too tired to continue on without some sleep. So they placed a cot across the front door so it couldn't be opened and handcuffed Pete in the cot. Harl went into the other room to sleep, and Grandma sat up in her rocking chair all night with a shotgun in her lap. Pete was a handsome scoundrel, and for quite some time he tried to win Grandma over so she'd let him escape. But she resisted his flirtation. The next morning, Harl, refreshed from his sleep, took Pete on to jail. This story too wins a nod from us, the listeners. Never mind that Grandma was probably no more than 18 or 19 at the time this occurred. We nod to applaud her strength and loyalty to her husband and to acknowledge that he did the right thing. And our agreement strengthens our communal bond. So legends are fences. They're strong but gentle fences that in some ways surround us like a warm blanket. They're also walls that keep the uninitiated and unbelievers out. It isn't so much the stories themselves as our responses to them that tell us who the insiders and outsiders are. Robert Frost said that good fences make good neighbors. These legends also create and reinforce a community. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, you can email me at vanderj42@yahoo.com.